The morning of June 6, 1944, broke grey and cold over the English Channel, with waves crashing at heights of 4 to 6 feet against the steel hulls of the landing craft. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell stood on the bridge of USS Samuel Chase, watching hundreds of vessels converge toward a 5-mile stretch of French coastline designated Omaha Beach. The naval bombardment had begun at 0550 hours, and Mitchell could feel each explosion reverberate through the deck, plating beneath his boots. In his pocket, he carried a letter from his wife Sarah, written 3 weeks earlier, asking him to promise he would come home safe. He had memorized every word but could not bring himself to make that promise. What Mitchell did not know, what none of the 5,000 men aboard the transport ships steaming toward that blood-soaked shore could know, was that the most critical decision of the entire operation would not come from the generals in their command posts or the admirals on their flagships. It would come from a 32-year-old Coast Guard officer, whom his own crew had nicknamed Reckless for his supposedly impulsive nature during training exercises off the coast of Massachusetts. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What follows is the account of how Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell's split-second judgment, made in defiance of every tactical doctrine and standing order, would determine whether 320 American soldiers lived to see the sunset or died in the cold waters of the English Channel. Mitchell had earned his nickname honestly, though not for the reasons his detractors believed. During amphibious landing drills in Slapton Sands, he had repeatedly broken formation to reposition his landing craft, drawing written reprimands from 2 different superior officers. Captain Harold Brennan, the task force commander, had called Mitchell into his quarters aboard the USS Ancon just 3 days before the invasion and delivered a stark warning. "You follow the plan, Mitchell, or you will face a court-martial. We have spent 2 years preparing this operation, thousands of moving parts, all synchronized. One cowboy cannot jeopardize the lives of everyone else." Mitchell had stood at attention, his jaw tight, and responded with the only words he felt he could say. "Yes, sir, I understand, sir." But understanding and agreeing were 2 different things entirely. The plan for Omaha Beach called for precise timing. The first wave of infantry would land at 0630 hours, supported by amphibious tanks launched 3,000 yards offshore. The destroyers would cease fire at 0625 to avoid hitting friendly forces. Landing craft like Mitchell's Samuel Chase would deliver their human cargo in successive waves, maintaining formation and following designated channels, cleared of obstacles by Navy demolition teams. It was elegant in its complexity, a masterpiece of military planning that had consumed countless hours of the finest strategic minds in the Allied command. Mitchell knew the plan. He had studied it until he could recite it in his sleep. He also knew something that the men in the planning rooms, poring over their maps and charts, could not fully grasp. The ocean did not care about plans. Aboard Samuel Chase that morning were 320 men from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, veterans of North Africa and Sicily. Mitchell had gotten to know some of them during the voyage from England. Private First Class Robert Chen, 23 years old, from San Francisco, who carried a photograph of his younger sister and had promised her he would bring back a souvenir from Paris. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, 31, from Boston, who had 3 children he had never met, all born while he was overseas. Corporal David Washington, 25, from Alabama, who played harmonica in the evenings and could make even the most melancholy tune sound like hope. At 0600 hours, Mitchell received the order to proceed to the line of departure. Samuel Chase fell into formation with 11 other landing craft, their designation LCI-85, painted on the hull in white letters 3 feet tall. Each vessel carried roughly the same number of men, packed so tightly below decks that they could barely move. The smell of diesel fuel, seawater, and fear created an atmosphere Mitchell would never forget, no matter how many years he might live. The naval bombardment intensified as they approached the shore. Battleships USS Texas and USS Arkansas unleashed their 14-inch guns, each shell weighing 1,500 pounds and capable of obliterating a concrete bunker. Cruisers added their 8-inch batteries to the maelstrom. Mitchell counted the seconds between the flash and the concussion, calculating their distance from the beach. 4 miles, 3.5, 3. At 06:15, exactly on schedule, the bombardment began to shift inland. The tactical doctrine called for this adjustment to prevent friendly fire as the landing craft approached. Mitchell felt his stomach tighten. Through his binoculars, he could see the beach obscured by smoke and dust, but he could also see something else. The massive concrete fortifications on the bluffs overlooking the sand were still intact. The bombardment, for all its fury and expense, had failed to neutralize the defensive positions. He was not the only one who noticed. Through the radio net, he heard fragments of increasingly urgent communications, obstacles still in place. Heavy resistance. First wave taking casualties. At 06:20, Mitchell made visual contact with the first wave of landing craft hitting the beach. What he saw turned his blood cold. The ramps dropped, and men poured out into water that was chest-deep, waist-deep, neck-deep, depending on where the coxswain had been forced to stop. The German defensive fire, which the bombardment was supposed to have suppressed, erupted with devastating effect. Tracers stitched across the water. Men fell. The carefully rehearsed assault formations disintegrated within seconds. Mitchell gripped the rail of the bridge so hard his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Ensign Thomas Bradford, his executive officer, watched through his own binoculars, his face pale. "My God," Bradford whispered, "they are being massacred." The plan called for Samuel Chase to land at 06:35, exactly 15 minutes after the first wave. Mitchell checked his watch. 14 minutes. He looked at the beach again, at the bodies floating in the surf, at the landing craft burning on the sand, at the men seeking shelter behind steel obstacles that were supposed to have been cleared. 13 minutes. The radio crackled. "All craft, maintain schedule. Follow designated approach lanes. Do not deviate from assigned sectors." 12 minutes. Mitchell turned to Bradford. "Tom, what is the tide doing?" Bradford consulted his tables, though both men already knew the answer. "Coming in, sir. Rising approximately 1 foot every 10 minutes. Mitchell did the mathematics in his head. The obstacles the Germans had planted along the beach, steel hedgehogs and Belgian gates designed to tear open the hulls of landing craft, were currently visible at low tide. In 15 minutes, when Samuel Chase was scheduled to land, those obstacles would be just beneath the surface. Invisible. Lethal. 11 minutes. The next transmission came through clearly, the voice tight with stress but maintaining professional composure. "This is Control. First wave has encountered heavier than expected resistance. All subsequent waves will proceed as planned. Maintain formation and timing." Mitchell looked at the 320 men below his deck. He thought about Chen and his promise to his sister, about O'Brien and the 3 children he had never held, about Washington and his harmonica, about Sarah's letter in his pocket, asking for a promise he could not make. 10 minutes. He made his decision. "Come left to heading 270, Mitchell ordered. "Full speed." Bradford stared at him. "Sir, that takes us out of our assigned lane." "That takes us—" "I know exactly where it takes us," Mitchell interrupted. "Execute the order." "Sir, you heard Control. Captain Brennan will—" "Execute the order, Mr. Bradford." The young ensign hesitated only a moment longer, then relayed the command to the helmsman. Samuel Chase heeled slightly as she turned, breaking formation, accelerating away from her assigned position. The radio exploded with transmissions. "Samuel Chase, this is Control. You are off course. Return to assigned approach lane immediately." Mitchell picked up the handset. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Control, this is Samuel Chase. We have taken water in the engine room. Attempting to maintain steerage, will advise." It was a lie, and everyone listening knew it was a lie. But it bought him time. "Samuel Chase, state your intentions." Mitchell ignored the transmission. He was studying the beach through his binoculars, looking for something specific. The smoke from the bombardment was beginning to clear, and he could see the German fortifications more clearly now. The main concentrations of fire were focused on the designated landing zones, where the plan called for all the landing craft to arrive. But there, roughly 800 yards to the west, he could see a section of beach that appeared less heavily defended. The bluffs there were lower, the obstacles less dense, and most importantly, there was a small ravine cutting through the ridge that might offer the infantry a covered approach inland. It was not part of the plan. No demolition teams had been assigned to clear it. No naval gunfire had been directed at it. It was, by every measure of orthodox military thinking, completely wrong. Mitchell thought it might be the only chance his men had. "We are going in there," he told Bradford, pointing. "That draw between the two bluff sections, see it?" Bradford studied the terrain. "Sir, we do not have any intelligence on that sector. There could be mines, underwater obstacles, fortifications we cannot see." "There could be," Mitchell agreed. "But I know what is waiting in our assigned sector. I watched it happen to the first wave. Those men will die if we take them where the plan says to take them." "You are throwing away your career," Bradford said quietly. "You are risking a court-martial. They could charge you with mutiny, with cowardice, with—" "I know," Mitchell said, "but I am not asking you to share that risk. Put it in the log that I gave you a direct order, and you objected. That is true. I will take full responsibility." Bradford was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up his own binoculars and studied the alternative landing site. "The current will push us north as we approach. We will need to compensate by at least 15 degrees. "Agreed," Mitchell said. "And we should come in at an angle, not straight on. If there are obstacles we cannot see, it gives us a better chance to spot them and avoid." "Good thinking." Bradford set down his binoculars and met Mitchell's eyes. "For the record, sir, I think you're right. And if they court-martial you, I will testify to that." "Noted," Mitchell said. "Now let us bring these boys home." The radio had gone from urgent to furious. "Samuel Chase, you are ordered to return to your assigned sector immediately. Acknowledge." Mitchell acknowledged nothing. He was entirely focused on the approach now, watching the water for any sign of obstacles, studying the beach for defensive positions, calculating angles and distances. At 200 yards, he could see individual features on the shoreline. At 100 yards, he ordered the engines to slow. At 75 yards, he spotted the first line of obstacles, exactly where he had expected them, and called for a slight course correction that took Samuel Chase between two steel hedgehogs with perhaps 5 feet of clearance on either side. At 50 yards, the German defenders on the bluffs noticed them. Tracers began to reach out across the water, but the fire was sporadic, disorganized. Mitchell had been right. This sector was not as heavily defended. The Germans had concentrated their forces where they expected the landing to occur, where the plan said it would occur. At 30 yards, Mitchell ordered the ramp down and the engines into reverse, using the propellers to hold Samuel Chase steady against the incoming tide. "Go, go, go," he shouted down to the men below. The soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division poured out onto the ramp and into water that was only knee-deep at this point on the beach. They did not face the murderous fire that had shredded the first wave. They did not have to wade through chest-deep water while weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment. They hit the sand running, and they kept running, making for the ravine Mitchell had spotted. Not all of them made it. War does not grant perfect victories, and the German defenders, though surprised, still had weapons and training. Mitchell watched men fall, watched others drag their wounded comrades toward cover, watched sergeants and lieutenants shouting orders and organizing their units under fire. But the majority, the overwhelming majority, made it off the beach and into the ravine, where they found cover and began to organize for the advance inland. It took 4 minutes to empty Samuel Chase. When the last soldier had exited, Mitchell ordered the ramp up and the engines to full reverse. The landing craft backed away from the beach, threading between the obstacles that could have torn open her hull, and turned for the return journey to the transport ships to pick up the next wave. The radio remained ominously silent for the entire return trip. Mitchell knew what that meant. Brennan was no doubt conferring with higher command, deciding what charges to bring, preparing for the court-martial that would almost certainly end Mitchell's career and possibly send him to prison. He found that he did not care. When Samuel Chase pulled alongside USS Ancon, Mitchell was ordered to report to Captain Brennan immediately, leaving Bradford in command of the vessel. He climbed the ladder to the larger ship's deck, saluted the officer of the deck, and was escorted directly to the captain's quarters. Brennan was waiting with 2 other officers, a Marine Colonel Mitchell did not recognize, and a Navy commander who served as the task force legal officer. The atmosphere in the small room was cold enough to frost glass. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Brennan began, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You broke formation. You ignored direct orders. You endangered your crew and your cargo of soldiers. He saved 320 lives, and the Marine colonel interrupted. Maybe more. Brennan turned to face the Marine. Colonel Hartley, I appreciate your perspective, but the issue here is not outcomes. It is discipline. It is following orders. If every officer in this task force decided to improvise based on their personal judgment, then maybe fewer of my men would be dead on that beach, Hartley said, his voice hard. I have been getting reports for the last hour, Captain. Do you know what the casualty rate is in the assigned landing sectors? 40%. 40% casualties before most units even got off the beach. Do you know what the casualty rate is for the unit that Lieutenant Commander Mitchell delivered? Less than 8%. And they are already 1,000 yards inland, which is more than can be said for most of the first 3 waves. The room fell silent. Brennan looked at Mitchell, his expression unreadable. Is that true? I do not have the exact casualty figures, sir, Mitchell said carefully, but I observed the landing, and the colonel's assessment seems consistent with what I saw. You had no authority to deviate from the plan, Brennan said, but some of the heat had left his voice. No, sir, I did not, Mitchell agreed. I accept full responsibility for my actions. If you feel charges are warranted, I will not contest them. Brennan studied him for a long moment. What made you think you knew better than the entire planning staff? What made you think you had the right to throw away months of preparation? Mitchell chose his words carefully. Sir, I did not think I knew better than the planning staff, but I had information they did not have. I could see the beach in real time. I could see that the conditions we had planned for did not match the conditions we encountered. The bombardment had not suppressed the defenses. The obstacles had not been cleared. The first wave was being destroyed in the assigned sectors. I had to make a decision. Follow the plan and deliver my men into that, or use my judgment as an officer and find an alternative. Your judgment as an officer, Brennan repeated slowly. You understand that judgment is worth exactly nothing if it contradicts your orders. I understand that, sir. But I also understand that my first duty is to the men under my command, not to the plan, not to the orders, to the men. Colonel Hartley spoke again. Captain, I have been in combat in 3 different theaters. I have seen good officers and bad officers. I have seen officers who follow orders blindly and get their men slaughtered, and I have seen officers who have the courage to adapt when circumstances change. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell is the latter. If you court-martial him, you will be sending a message to every other officer in this task force that initiative is punished and blind obedience is rewarded. Is that really the message you want to send? Brennan looked down at the papers on his desk, then back up at Mitchell. You are aware, Lieutenant Commander, that several other landing craft followed your lead. Once they saw where you were going and how you were succeeding, they broke formation and followed you. By the end of the first hour, nearly 30% of the follow-on waves had landed in your sector instead of their assigned sectors. Mitchell had not known that. He felt something shift in his chest, a weight he had not realized he was carrying beginning to lift. No, sir, I was not aware. Do you know what that means? Brennan asked. It means your decision, your impulsive, reckless, unauthorized decision, may have saved over 1,000 lives. It also means it completely disrupted the landing plan and forced a major reallocation of resources and fire support. It created chaos. Yes, sir. It also may have made the difference between success and failure on Omaha Beach, Brennan said quietly. The sector you chose became the main penetration point for the advance inland. By 1400 hours, elements of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had pushed through that ravine and begun rolling up the German defensive line from the flank. By 1800 hours we had secured the beachhead. Mitchell said nothing. There was nothing he could say. Brennan stood and walked to the small porthole, looking out at the armada of ships filling the channel. I should court-martial you, he said, not turning around. By every regulation, by every standard of military discipline, I should bring you up on charges. But Colonel Hartley is right. The message that would send is worse than the breach of discipline. So instead, I'm going to do something that may be even more painful for you. He turned back to face Mitchell. I am going to commend you. I am going to write in my report that Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell displayed exceptional initiative and tactical judgment under combat conditions, and that his actions contributed materially to the success of the landing. I am going to recommend you for a medal. And every time you look at that medal, I want you to remember that you were lucky. You could just as easily have led those men into a trap. You could have hit a minefield or an underwater obstacle that you did not see. You could have been wrong. I know, sir, Mitchell said quietly. Do you? Brennan asked. Do you really? Because I wonder if the reason they call you reckless is not because you take unnecessary risks, but because you take necessary risks that other people are too afraid to take. I wonder if what looks like recklessness to comfortable people behind desks is actually courage when you are standing on the deck of a landing craft with 320 lives depending on your judgment. Mitchell met his captain's eyes and saw something there he had not expected. Respect, grudging and complicated, but respect nonetheless. You are dismissed, Lieutenant Commander, Brennan said. Get back to your ship. We have more men to land. Mitchell saluted, turned and left the captain's quarters. As he descended the ladder back to Samuel Chase, he felt the weight of the morning settle onto his shoulders. The relief that his men had survived, mixed with the grief for those who had not. The knowledge that his judgment had been vindicated, mixed with the terrible awareness of how easily it could have been catastrophically wrong. Bradford was waiting on deck when Mitchell returned. Well? The ensign asked. We are not being court-martialed, Mitchell said. We are being commended. Bradford's eyes widened. You are joking. I wish I were, Mitchell said. It would be simpler if they had just court-martialed me. I do not understand. Neither do I, Tom. Neither do I. But over the following hours and days, as Samuel Chase made trip after trip to the beach, as the beachhead expanded and the Allied forces pushed inland, Mitchell began to understand. He began to understand that war was not a chess game, where pieces moved according to rigid rules. It was chaos and confusion and fear, and the plans that looked perfect on paper often shattered on contact with reality. He began to understand that the finest quality an officer could possess was not obedience but judgment, not the ability to follow orders, but the wisdom to know when orders no longer applied to the situation at hand. He also began to understand the weight of command, the terrible burden of making decisions that determined whether men lived or died. Every night, lying in his narrow bunk aboard Samuel Chase, he thought about the 8% casualties his landing had suffered. 8% was a miracle compared to 40%. 8% had allowed 294 men to survive who might otherwise have perished, but 8% was still 26 men. 26 men who had walked onto his ship alive and been carried off dead or wounded. 26 men whose names he did not know but whose deaths were his responsibility. The nickname Reckless followed him through the rest of the war. Mitchell served in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, in the final operations against the Japanese home islands. He made commander, then captain, then retired from the Navy in 1953, with a chest full of medals and a reputation as one of the most effective amphibious warfare officers in the service. But he never forgot June 6, 1944. Never forgot the grey morning and the cold water and the terrible arithmetic of deciding where 320 men would land. Never forgot the faces of Chen and O'Brien and Washington, who all survived the war and went home to their families, though Washington lost his left leg below the knee and never played harmonica quite the same way again. In 1964, on the 20th anniversary of the landing, Mitchell received an invitation to speak at a ceremony honoring the veterans of Omaha Beach. He almost declined, uncomfortable with the attention, but his wife Sarah, who had waited for him through 4 years of war and never complained, convinced him to go. The ceremony was held in a high school gymnasium in Virginia, decorated with American flags and photographs from the war. About 200 veterans attended, older men now, many walking with canes, some in wheelchairs. Mitchell sat on the stage with other officers, feeling out of place, wondering what he could possibly say that would mean anything to these men who had been through hell. When his turn came to speak, he stood at the podium and looked out at the audience. And there, in the third row, he saw a face he recognized. Older, grayer, but unmistakable. It was Chen, Robert Chen from San Francisco, who had promised his sister a souvenir from Paris. Mitchell had not prepared a speech. He had assumed he would say something conventional about duty and honor and sacrifice. But looking at Chen, at all the other faces in that gymnasium, he found himself telling the truth instead. "They called me reckless," he began. "My crew, my fellow officers, they called me reckless because I did not always follow the rules. Because I made decisions that contradicted my orders. Because I broke formation and led 320 men to a beach that was not on any plan, not on any map, not part of any carefully designed operation. And I want you to know something. They were right. It was reckless. I could have been wrong. I could have led you into a trap. I could have gotten you all taken down. The fact that it worked out, the fact that most of you survived, that was not because I was smart or brave or special. It was because I was lucky, and I have spent every day of the last 20 years being grateful for that luck and wondering what I would have done if I had been wrong." He paused, searching for the right words. "But I also want you to know this. I would make the same choice again. Not because I am brave, not because I am reckless, but because in that moment, with the information I had, with what I could see happening on that beach, I believed it was your best chance. Maybe your only chance. And that was what mattered to me. Not the plan, not the orders, not my career, you, the 320 men whose lives had been entrusted to my command. That was my duty, and I would not change it." When he finished speaking and returned to his seat, he expected polite applause and nothing more. What he got instead was a standing ovation that lasted 3 minutes. And afterward, Chen found him in the crowd and shook his hand and said simply, "Thank you for bringing me home." Mitchell never spoke publicly about June 6th again, but he kept Chen's address, and for the next 15 years, until Chen passed away from a heart attack in 1979, they exchanged Christmas cards every year. Brief messages, nothing profound, just two men who had shared a moment when everything hung in the balance and had somehow both survived. The historical debate about Mitchell's decision continued long after his death in 1991. Military historians argued about whether he had truly saved lives or simply got lucky. Tactical analysts critiqued his judgment, pointing out all the ways his gamble could have failed. Naval officers studied the case in their training, though they disagreed passionately about whether Mitchell should be held up as a model or a cautionary tale. But the 320 men who were on Samuel Chase that morning, and the 1,000 or more who followed them into that unplanned sector, and the families those men went home to and built and raised, they had a different perspective. They knew that wars are not won by perfect plans executed flawlessly. Wars are won by imperfect men making impossible choices with incomplete information, and living with the consequences. They knew that sometimes the most important thing an officer can do is not follow orders, but know when orders no longer serve their intended purpose. They knew that the line between recklessness and courage is sometimes so thin that it cannot be seen until years later, when history delivers its verdict. And they knew, with the certainty that comes from having lived through the moment, that on that grey morning in June 1944, when the waves were high and the casualties were mounting and the plan was falling apart, James Mitchell made the right call. The rest, as they say, is history, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.